Now, we have in the Islamic community today, especially in the last century and the beginning of this century, very stiff Muslims who don't want to move even their muscles to have any kind of fun. And this was best exemplified by the Wahhabi school, to the point that they ban any form of music. They don't want to play it, they don't want to hear it. Now, but in our history, this attitude was not the dominant attitude. Because in the earlier Islamic history, Muslim scholars were able to quote from Bukhari and from the Sirah to justify the playing of musical instruments. And the Hadithic literature, which is cited often by our scholars, was in Bukhari, when you had some Ethiopians, I'm sure all of you are familiar with this, playing musical instrument and with their other gadgets they had in their hands, dancing and playing music. Aisha wanted to watch what was going on, and who was selling him and looking on? The Prophet Muhammad himself. Now, of course, that particular hadith had been the bone of contention between the Wahhabi school, who are very grim in their understanding of the life of the Prophet, and the more open and accommodating Muslim scholars who would say, why would Bukhari report this? If the why didn't the Prophet just say to Aisha, sit down, we don't watch that? He didn't do that. So for that reason, some of the scholars have used that, and many others, to illustrate that the Prophet indeed sanctioned forms of entertainment that were not Quranically negative. That's the key word here. If the form of recreation and entertainment makes us laugh and we are happy with ourselves, but not subversive, that was okay. But if the form of entertainment become very seductive, very degrading, very salacious, and very dunyaistic, that's a word I coined. You can be sure that I didn't use the word secularistic. I used the word dunyaistic. Because you see, in Roman times, the Romans and the Greeks had forms of self-entertainment which one from a Muslim point of view would call dunyaistic, in the sense that you engage in those sports and entertain yourself because you believe that there is no accountability for what you're doing. You only believe that the only reality is this dunya. So I can do anything I want. And today in modern America, we have a mantra that we hear on TV sometimes, or we hear from some of our peers and colleagues: if it feels good, do it. Now, a Muslim cannot do that. You see what I'm saying? If it feels good, do it. You see, Muslims cannot say that. It may feel good, but it's not Quranic. So you can't do it. You see what I'm saying? It's not halal. Now you see, this is the limit, the borderline. One of the great Western thinkers described the human being as homo ludus. Man is the playing creature. You see what I'm saying? Man is the playing creature, homo ludus. The Latin word ludus means to play. Man is the playing creature. That's the whole idea of Huizinga. That's the name of this philosopher. Huizinga. You can read him. Now the whole idea is that the human being likes to entertain himself. And that even in the lower forms of life, like the monkeys, they also have games. They entertain themselves. Now, human beings do entertain themselves. So as Muslims, the manner in which we entertain ourselves must be modeled after the Prophet. The ayah out there, لَهَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. The Prophet, being the finest example for us, provides the model to imitate. Now, the Prophet is not living in the year 2000 in America today. So we can relate to him analogically in this regard. That's why I told you, you cannot be living in America, in San Francisco, in Fresno, and say, well, I'm going to be entertaining myself only by riding horses or camels. No, we don't have that. And the Prophet certainly will not tell you that the only form of entertainment you can judge yourself is buying on camels. No, he will not say that. Because human beings have evolved to a higher level of technology to the point that they now have substitute for the animals, even though we still honor those animals by naming our cars after animals. We call them Cephas, cougars, all kinds of names. So, I mean, the reality here is that when we follow the example of the Prophet ﷺ, we have to recognize the governing principles. One, that during the lifetime of the Prophet, based on what we know in the Sirah, there was forms of recreation. And as the Muslims became more powerful and they became more dominant, they had other forms of entertainment. But that entertainment which deviates from the Quran were dismissed by the ulama as unacceptable. Those forms of entertainment, whether it's humor, like telling stories and jokes, and of course in the Islamic world we had a lot of jokes to entertain ourselves after we eat, and that tradition has continued in many parts of the Muslim world. They capture in writing this sense of humor, and you have many writings of Muslims that capture this body of literature. Muslim form of entertainment, whether in the musical form, continued. What the ulama did not want was Muslims to get too carried away with these musical performances that begin to undermine their iman and their faith in Islam. And of course, you know that the musicians can entertain because the different forms of human speech. If you study speech 101, you know that human beings use words to give you command, as in the military. Human beings can use words to entertain, like singers. Human beings can use words to inform, to educate you. So through speech, we can do a lot of things. And during the lifetime of the Prophet, he has lighter moments, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he has lighter moments where he would joke with his contemporaries, his companions. Because he was a human being and he's supposed to be an example. So all the forms of speech were used by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if you read your speech 101 introduction, you will see all the different forms of human speeches. The Prophet used them, but he stayed away from four-letter words. And he made sure that while you are using speech to entertain yourself, because you can tell stories to entertain people, you can use speech to come up with jokes that will make people laugh. When they were unhappy, they begin to smile. The Prophet was smiling most of the time. Now, when it comes to other forms of entertainment, the Prophet also demonstrated, because we know from Aisha that the Prophet used to race with with her. We have that in Bukhari. This is not Hadith Daif, this is in Bukhari. And we see Bukhari as the number one book of Hadith after the Quran. The Prophet racing with Aisha. You see what I'm saying? This is a fact. Now, we have this. So, naturally, when we talk about the Prophet, therefore, we must make sure that we don't go to the extreme position of making him a one-dimensional man who was all the time very grim and stern-faced. Although there were moments when he was like that. But you don't reduce him to a one-dimensional human being who live in that world of grimness. But at the same time, you don't want to use the limited evidence we have in Hadithic literature to make him sanctioning all forms of entertainment, even those that will fall under the category of what I call dunyaistic form of self-entertainment. You see what I'm saying?